Professor Penmer, thank you so much for that kind introduction. But as you mentioned to me earlier, I think your students perhaps are not feeling as though you've been as kind, right? I understand you just finished an exam, am I right? Right, so maybe not as kind with the exam? No, but thank you very much. And Dean Norris, Dean Mesner, I'm honored to be here. Thank you for having me. What I would like to do is kind of focus on this notion of capitalism at the crossroads. It builds on what Aaron has just been talking about, and I choose this for two reasons, as a title. The first one, I think, as we've been saying all along, is that I believe, like others, that we are kind of at one of those inflection points when everything changes, because change tends to happen quickly when it finally happens, and I think we are on the precipice of that, and I'll speak more about that. But the second reason is because that was the title of my book. I think interestingly enough, this book, this is the third edition here, but the first edition came out in 2005. And I'll have to say, I still have fond memories of this. I was advised against this title in 2005. A number of people who said, are you really sure you want to use that as it? Don't you think that's kind of over the top? Capitalism at the crossroads? And I'll have to say, standing here today, I feel somewhat vindicated for having chosen that title, because to be perfectly honest, for you Game of Thrones fans, winter is coming, right? At least winter is coming for business education, business as usual in capitalism as we've known it for the last 30 plus years. I think that is absolutely the case. And let me say a little bit about that, because we have seen this accelerating pace, as Aaron referred to. It's picked up in a significant way, and I'll speak more about that. Just a couple of years back, right, was the first time that our friend Larry Fink came forward with his letter, right, to CEOs making this point. That's just a couple of years back, and then, as Aaron referenced, just now a couple of months back, the Business Roundtable has come forward, with a kind of a reversal, for the last 20 plus years since the mid '90s, their annual guidance was really about shareholder primacy, right? And so now they've suddenly flipped, right? That the new purpose of the corporation is exactly what Aaron was just talking about. So I think we have increasing evidence, and I'll speak more about that we are at one of those kind of inflection points. But if we step back a bit, right, sort of think about this in broader historical terms, I want to spend a little bit of time talking about that. The truth is that what we think of now as capitalism has gone through many twists and turns over, say, the last 400 years, even though it wasn't called capitalism back then. But if we think back to what I think of as sort of the inception of what we might think of as capitalism, was the founding of the British East India Company in the year 1600. Right? It was really the first joint stock company. And since then, we've cycled through a lot of different things. There's mercantilists, right? There's invisible hands. There's corporate persons. There's robber barons. We've been through a very interesting kind of evolution over the last 400 years. But if we just, kind of think about the fact that this most recent kind of iteration of the way we think about capitalism is not that old, right? It really only dates back to the 80s, right? So for those of you in the room that think that the way that we've been doing business is forever, it's not, right? I mean, this sort of notion, and this is our little, this Michael Douglas and Greed is Good, the shareholder primacy way of thinking about the linkage between business and society only dates back to the 80s, and I'll talk more about that. Carl Jung had an interesting way of characterizing this. He used an interestingly psychological term, enantiodromia, which is the tendency for things to change into their opposites. Right? And I think the story of capitalism is kind of like that. It sort of waxed and waned, kind of ebbed and flowed. And I think we're at one of those reversal points again, and to realize that the way that we've thought about it for the last 30 or 40 years is really a relatively recent phenomenon. So if we go back just 100 years, right? Think about 100 years, kind of coming out of the robber baron era, after World War I, we have the crash, right? And now suddenly people are thinking about business in very different terms than they were the turn of the century during the robber baron era. We had the progressives that kind of came on and put some damper on kind of rampant, capitalists and robber barons. But after the crash and the Great Depression and World War II, we see the rise of, statism broadly, right, in terms of the Soviet Union, communist China, and so forth. And then, here, even in the US, we see government very much on the rise, right? That with FDR, with the New Deal, with Keynesianism, that there's an important role the government plays in stimulating the economy. The Marshall Plan, the emergence of the Cold War. There's this sense, right, coming out of the Second World War, that government is a really crucial force in, sort of in mediating the economy, in managing the economy, and the role that they play more broadly in society. And corporations sort of emerging from the Second World War were thought of very differently than they are today, or that they have been for the last 30 or 40 years. It was the era of what's been called welfare capitalism, right? That you have, kind of the modern Republicans, as they were called, like Ike Eisenhower, who was a Republican who very much adopted the New Deal philosophy, right? Who acknowledged that, government's role was important, in terms of economic stimulus, but also in terms of regulation and in terms of safety nets and social safety nets and so forth. This was the era when corporations, were all about job security, providing pensions, building the middle class in the US. That was the era I grew up in, right, as a somewhat proud baby boomer. And GM was known as Generous Motors back in those days, right? That was the era when it was Generous Motors. And even, I've got a couple of quotes here from kind of famous academics, like Chester Barnard and Phil Selznick, who at the time, and I think even business schools in the 50s and 60s, sorry for the history lesson here, but business schools back then also thought very differently about business. They viewed business as an institution. And as an institution, business had an important role to play in society, in communities, in fair wage for employees, in social investment in communities and so forth. So very, very, very different kind of philosophy and attitude, thinking back to the post-war years, the 50s, 60s, and even on into the 70s. And at that time, at the end of the Second World War, the voices of what we might think of now as economic freedom, sort of the unfettered free market philosophy as the best way to kind of manage society and the economy, were an endangered species, right? I mean, this was the idea that somehow national planning and having a strong national force is the road to perdition. It was Hayek's notion of the road to serfdom. Of course, he had some legitimate reason for that, having just lived through World War II in Europe, right? He had some legitimate reason to be concerned. But the idea that the more that you get the national government involved, the more likely that you end up, in a fascist state, was, at that point in time, close to extinction as an idea. You had, in fact, then some voices, not very many, uniting together in what's been called the Great Persuasion to bring that voice back, because they were concerned that it was actually near extinction. The idea that you have, say, the DuPont brothers, you have the Chicago school economists, including, Frank Knight and Milton Friedman and others, a few kind of important corporate voices at the time, uniting together to try to really bring this message back, because it was not at all a message in good currency at the time. And, this sort of culminated, at least institutionally, in the creation of the Mont Pelerin Society that some of you may have heard of, which first meeting was in 1947, and has been meeting ever since, still very, very much active. And the purpose of the Mont Pelerin Society was to bring the voices, academics, business people, financiers, who believed in this idea of economic freedom, together so that they could actually create a united front. That was really the purpose of the Mont Pelerin Society. Hayek, one of the key players, but so too Milton Friedman and others. And it took, I think we often lose sight of this, it took 30 plus years before this voice really began to get traction, right? I mean, it's not as though they weren't working at it, starting really in the late 40s, but it really wasn't getting much traction over the 40s, over the 50s, into the 60s. It really was until the 70s that this thing really began to kind of catch, right? And you had, at least in part, the Arab oil embargo, you had, the stagflation era and a kind of a flat stock market, so companies, there was increasing dissatisfaction that companies weren't delivering adequate returns. The market was basically flat for a decade. Whip inflation now, was the political slogan. And you had the beginnings, the emergence of international competition from Japan for the first time that was adding additional pressure, right? That was really, really sort of changing the way we thought about companies and the role of capitalism in the world. And that was then, that was the prelude to the 80s when everything flipped. It was during the 80s, that you had the piece by Milton Friedman, the piece by Jensen and Meckling on the theory of the firm, which is all about agency theory. In the 80s, you had the Greed is Good movie and the idea of efficient markets, where all information is incorporated in stock price, so stock price is a valid measure of the company's, kind of validating strategy. That's when this way of thinking really took hold for the first time, right? It was there kind of screaming from the rooftops for 30 years, but it didn't really get traction until the 80s. And that was the period of time. That's when I became, I came as a young assistant professor at Michigan in 1985. So in some ways, this has been my life story, right? I witnessed the business school. I was at Michigan at the time, but business schools in general got taken over by this perspective, to be quite blunt, right? In the 1980s, they got taken over by this. I still remember some of the older professors at Michigan when I joined as a young, wet behind the ears assistant professor, who had been there for 20, 30 plus years, who were very much cut out of that institutionalist cloth, right? Who thought of they thought about the role of business as an institution, right? They were from the old days, and watched as they gradually got pushed out and retired. We had kind of PhD trained people really come in a significant way in business schools for the first time in the 80s, and it completely flipped everything, right? Business schools changed entirely. And I've spent the last, 30 years of my career sort of, I don't know if I would say battling against that, but at least sort of trying to create a counterpoint or how it might be important to think about that differently at Michigan, North Carolina, Cornell, and so forth, and now most recently at Vermont. I'll say another word or two about that. And, if we're honest with ourselves, sort of look clinically at what this form of capitalism has wrought over the last 30 years, it isn't necessarily a real pretty picture, right? I mean, it just isn't, if we're honest with ourselves. That, yes, there's no question that financial capitalism, we can think of it as financial capitalism, has generated enormous amounts of wealth for some, right, for some investors, and lifted a lot of people, billions of people, out of extreme poverty, especially in China, right? Over the last, we have to admit that that's the case, over the last 20 plus years. But, half the carbon exhaled since the Cold War has happened over that period of time. We've extinguished, some would say, close to half the species on the planet. McKibben's quote, "Climate change is the greatest accomplishment of humanity." Generous Motors doing its best to shed the bulk of its North American workforce. The kind of attitudes have really changed. Wage holders have become shareholders. It's kind of pretty much everybody for themselves, not like it was back in the 50s and 60s. And the level of inequality in the world has reached levels not seen since the late 20s. That's really what has been wrought. And as far as, the U.S. is concerned, I love this quote by Rutger Bregman, "There's almost no country on earth where the American dream is less likely to come true than the U.S." That's kind of the state of where we are today. And we've had, kind of dissenting voices, countervailing forces that have been there, right, that have emerged over the last 30 plus years. There can be no question about that, and I'm about to flash a big long list of buzzwords. So, you can find your favorite, right? There's lots of them out there. And they all kind of have often their own particular aficionados and advocates. And each kind of has its own following. And the problem is that it's very tribal, right? And often competitive, which doesn't really do us much good at all, right? When you stop and think about it. So there's been, while there are voices that bring countervailing perspectives and different points of view over the last 20 or 30 years, there's been, until recently, really no sort of unified way of thinking about this, or a counter point of view that is at more of a meta level. There have been lots of kind of smaller level takes on it, right? But I think that's beginning to change, and that's why I think we're perhaps on the cusp of something really important, that maybe we're ready to flip again. And part of the reason is because where the message is coming from now, increasingly, right, it's like that old horror movie trope, where the babysitter is getting these kind of creepy calls from some guy. So she calls the police, and the police call back, and they say the call's coming from inside the house. I mean, that's what's going on now, right? I mean, increasingly, the alarm is coming from the capitalist class itself, right? That's new, right? That typically did not happen, as little as even a few years back. So I think that is a strong indicator that perhaps we really are at one of those tipping points, not unlike the 80s, right? When once that perspective, which had been working for 30 years to bring its point of view forward, once the climate was ripe for it, it flipped rapidly. And I think we're there again. I think we're on the verge of that again. So a little quote from the Business Roundtable announcing the release of their new statement: 181 CEOs who commit to lead their companies for the benefit of all stakeholders, employees, just as Aaron was saying, right? And we can say, okay, gee, that's great. It's sort of a symbolic statement. It's kind of toothless. It's not like there's no real commitment there, but at the same time, they're on record, right? I mean, for the last 20 plus years, the statement has been completely the reverse of that. So they're on record, but it still does leave open the question, what will it take to realize, this Business Roundtable's kind of, quote, new vision of capitalism? Think of it as stakeholder or sustainable capitalism. And I think we could spend the entire day discussing this, and probably most of us would not disagree that it's going to require some changes in policy, right? I mean, how do we internalize externalities? Maybe we need, taxes on high-speed transactions. We could go, right? There's plenty of policy changes that could facilitate, the financial infrastructure that supports the capitalist endeavor probably needs to be transformed. We need a completely different scorecard. Quarterly earnings need to be discarded, as the way in which we evaluate. So there are probably plenty of things on that front too. Governance, like, maybe we could have a conversation about executive compensation, right, and how that gets done. Not to mention lots of strategies and management practices of which, Aaron, I think you've just heard plenty, right, in terms of interface. So we could have a whole day dedicated to that. But if I have to distill it down to one thing, right, I mean, I would sort of say that it's really about purpose, right? And so I think the Business Roundtable got it right in that sense, that if you have to crystallize all of this down to one thing, it really comes down to a question of what is the purpose of business? That's what needs to shift. And the Business Roundtable got it right. I think we're at the point where we're ready to agree that a different kind of purpose is necessary. Now, we see companies more and more, you probably can't see that little Tesla thing there, but there are more and more kind of really lofty, somewhat flowery statements of purpose by companies, and again, I'm not opposed to it. I think it's great, to have these kinds of statements of this is the purpose or the mission of our company. It's different than the mission statements like from the 80s and 90s, which tended to be more technocratic, and competitive. So these are much more societally focused, and so I think that's all good. But, just leaving it at that, is how do you turn it into reality, right? Because oftentimes there's the purpose statement, and maybe that's as far as it goes. You don't actually see it lived out for real, in terms of what the company says. So, we've few of my colleagues and I, over the last couple of years, have tried to take a close look at a few companies. It turned out to be 15, where through various means we were able to identify them as being kind of sustainable, transformational outliers, in this space. Interface being one of them. So Aaron knows the results that I'm about to describe, and I'll take Interface in vain in part of it as well. And so we were interested in trying to kind of X-ray them and understand what is it that those companies are doing, right? That really sort of would set them apart from many others. And, so here's the companies we studied. And what we found was that there's sort of an architecture to this at some level, with purpose like the roof and values like the foundation. And then you would typically find lots of kind of strategic initiatives around experiments, technology development and capabilities and partnering, goals and metrics, rewards and incentives, that's all really important. But what we found is that for many companies, most companies have this bottom part, right, kind of articulated, and more companies have this broad societal purpose. But often what happens is the purpose statement remains hanging there, and then if you actually look at the goals and metrics, and if you look at the rewards and incentives, they're all but detached from the underlying statement of purpose. They're typically very operational. So there might be kind of financial goals and metrics, and then usually operational goals and metrics around water use and energy use, sort of eco-efficiency goals. Not that that's bad, right? That's fine. But if you look at the typical company today, that bottom part, there's really no connection to the purpose statement is left hanging there, right? There's like a disconnect between the stated purpose and the operational infrastructure of the company itself. And what we found, among other things, was with these 15 companies that we looked at that we thought were kind of outliers on the leading edge, they had all kind of created another kind of layer to this architecture that we're calling aspirations and quests, which is the connective tissue between the statement of purpose and the operating infrastructure of the company itself. So, most of the companies had this as a way of kind of connecting the purpose. It's like double-clicking on purpose, right, and kind of bringing it to life in a real-world way that's directly relevant for those companies. So you just heard from Erin, right? I think she explained very clearly what that looks like in the context for interface, where there is a broad statement of mission and purpose around climate takeback, but they don't leave it at that, right? There are a set of very well-articulated aspirations and quests around love, carbon, live zero, and so forth, with very specific initiatives and metrics that are attached to each of those that bring that to life in a very important way, right? You're not left hanging with this just kind of general lofty purpose statement. And we found this in most of the other companies that we took a close look at. Probably most people are familiar with Unilever. Very much the case where Unilever has articulated what they call their 3 big goals, but those are really in our lexicon aspirations and quests, because hanging off of those, like improving the health and well-being of more than 1 billion, enhancing the livelihoods for millions, reducing environmental impact by half, they've articulated very specific goals and metrics where you can actually measure progress toward it, right, over time. So it's a way of operationalizing purpose and being able to tell whether or not you're actually making headway, as opposed to the traditional metrics which are very year-to-year operational. These are strategic kind of goals and metrics. Or 7th Gen, which I think probably everyone is familiar with, a fine Vermont company, now part of Unilever, where mission has been the same for some time, to inspire a consumer revolution that nurtures the health of the next 7 generations. Very broad, right? Very lofty, but they don't leave it at that, right? And I know you can't see this, but they have 4 very specific, kind of operationalized aspirations and quests that are around things like building community, and I'll pick one, which is transform commerce, and then around transform commerce as one of the aspirations and quests. They've articulated a set of specific goals where they measure progress toward them, and then they connect the actual rewards and incentives for everyone in the company to those goals and metrics that operationalize the aspiration and quest. Every single person in the company is involved in that in terms of the reward and incentive system. So there's sort of a cascade, a virtuous circle around this that helps bring the whole thing to life. So if we think about companies going down this path, right, and we see, the call coming from inside the house, with BlackRock and the Business Roundtable and so forth, I think that's all very positive. I think it leaves us with a sense of optimism. But then we have to ask the question, what about business schools? Because let's face it, I think business schools really were in some ways the motive force that created and fed the transformation to the shareholder primacy model in the 80s. Without business schools flipping and training a generation of people who thought that way, we wouldn't be where we are today, right? So I believe it's incumbent on business schools to lead the flip. As it is now, they're not, right? I don't think business schools are leading the flip, but they could. And so I wanted to talk about One example, right, which is this program at Vermont that I've been involved with for the last 5 or 6 years, where we had the rare opportunity to actually start with a clean sheet of paper and develop a completely new MBA program from scratch called the Sustainable Innovation MBA, where from start to finish, it's focused on exactly the kinds of things that we've been talking about here, right? So it's a purpose-driven MBA program and a purpose-driven business school. The purpose is to reinvent business education and develop a new generation of leaders who will leverage the power of capitalism to solve the world's most pressing sustainability challenge. Start to finish, so, I think this is from a timing point of view, I think it makes good sense, because if you look at MBA programs across the country, you'll find that most are, it's a declining category. The number of students applying to traditional MBAs is in decline everywhere, right? Including the top 20 MBA programs. That's happening. That should be a pretty strong signal. We see MBA programs going belly up, being shuttered, being closed down, including some right here in North Carolina, like Wake Forest, right? Just shut their MBA program down. We will see more and more of that in the coming years. Probably see a shakeout of business schools. We'll see a bunch of business schools go under, over the course of the next 5 to 10 years. I would, as probably a safe prediction. Which is why I think the time is way past ripe for business schools to step up, right? Which means not just kind of adopting the typical kind of reaction, which, makes sense at some level, and what I spent 20 plus years of my life doing at, Michigan and North Carolina and Cornell. And I don't mean to denigrate it, but it's a saddlebag approach, which means you throw some, you create a center, you design a few elective courses that get offered in the second year. It stimulates some research and some papers get written, and that's all great, right? I mean, it's often very high quality work, but it doesn't change the horse, right? You can always just take the saddle off, and it's the same old horse. So the time has come for us to, genetically engineer a new horse when it comes to business education, where from start to finish, it communicates a different vision for what the purpose of business is in the world. And I think that can really help accelerate the rate at which this transformation occurs. And, I clearly get that vibe here at Appalachian State. So that's why I'm really excited to be here, and get to know you guys and work maybe a little bit more. So to summarize and to close, it's time to put the horse back in front of the cart. I think we've had it backwards now for 30 or 40 years, and it looks, something like this in terms of the underlying logic of shareholder primacy. The causal logic is our focus is on generating earnings because earnings are what drive share price. This is the assumption. I'm not saying I agree with it. And if we drive share price, high share price validates our strategy and business model because markets are efficient and because we don't trust managers, because they're probably working at somebody else's behest other than shareholders. So we should hold them accountable. And if they don't drive share price, then the market for corporate control will come in and take control. And that if we do all those things, that's how we add societal value, right? That's the causal logic of the shareholder primacy model. And I think we've seen the flaws in that way of thinking. It turns out that it's just not the case, right? Almost every step in that causal chain has been proven to be, it just doesn't work that way. Earnings really don't generate share price, if you look at it empirically. And driving share price in no way validates strategy and so forth. Right? So I think we're on the cusp of, and there's a wonderful book I think that goes into that in some depth. Some of you may know Rappaport's book, Saving Capitalism from Short-Termism. So I think we're in the midst of kind of flipping that. We'll call it, the stakeholder sustainable capitalism causal logic, which looks something like, our first step is to, how do we add societal value? That should be the purpose of the business, right, is solving actual problems. And that'll help us then validate a strategy and business model, which is how we're going to create shareholder value, which allows us to generate a surplus. And that's important because solving social and environmental problems in the world ought to be the main purpose of business. And we get at that by creating value for all constituencies and resolving, what seem to be surface conflicts among them, rather than just assuming there's a trade-off among stakeholders. And that's how we'll best reward investors and owners, and that's how we'll generate the surplus for reinvestment, back in the company in order for this to become a virtuous circle. I think that's the logic of the future as we head into, the post-era of shareholder primacy. And I, actually had articulated this thing called the Sustainable Value Framework 20 years ago, which is some version of that, that if you're interested, you can have a look. So on that front, let me close and say, business for good, I think it's really about, as a company, as an organization, as a business school, it's about finding your North Star and making it stick. So let me stop there and thank you all.